Well, it's a great honor to be joined by Nadine Strossen. She served as the national president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 and till 2008. And she is professor emerita at New York Law School. How are you doing, Nadine? Thank you for being on this show.
I'm doing very well, Chuang. It's wonderful to be your guest.
Yeah, awesome. It's the honor is all mine. I should like to begin by asking you, what does it mean to be a civil libertarian? You've been one for decades, so I'm sure you can have a.
Excellent. It's an excellent question because there is no formal legal definition, but the term civil liberties is generally used to refer to rights that individuals have vis-a-vis their government in order to exercise and enjoy not only personal liberty, but to meaningfully participate in a democratic republic. The most fundamental civil liberties include freedom of speech, thought, conscience, religion, belief, association, petition, and assembly. Other fundamental rights, and by the way, the term fundamental rights is often used synonymously with civil liberties, include the right to due process of law, to fair trial, to equal protection of the law, and to personal privacy. But the ACLU's conception, along with that of the United States Supreme Court, if I do say so, is that this is not a static concept, that it should be re-examined and developed in light of changing social facts in terms of changing technological realities to evolve as other factors in our society and culture evolve.
Mhm. Would you say that civil liberties in America has been better or worse?
These are such great questions. So I'm not going to say that from now on. Well, I'll just assume that every question is going to be great. But I want to thank you
I'll try to meet that
for the
expectation.
for the thoughtfulness of them. There is absolutely no doubt that over the course of American history, the state of civil liberties has dramatically improved. And at times, the progress is slower than one would want. And at times, there are some setbacks. We've seen that recently. But in fairness, if you take a long range perspective, we are infinitely closer to the founders' ideal of liberty and justice for all than we were when they penned those phrases, when we had chattel slavery, when women essentially had no legal rights, when in fact even white males who were not property owners couldn't vote. Then, of course, we had the legacy of Jim Crow. We had enormous repression of dissenting voices and anti-war voices early in the 20th century, which is what led to the founding of the ACLU. And I have to say, in my lifetime, there have been enormous strides on racial justice. Yes, we still have a lot of progress to make, but when I was born, Brown versus Board of Education had not yet been decided. We still had racially segregated schools by law. We still had government mandated Christian prayers in the public schools. The Supreme Court, even at the time that I started law school, which wasn't ancient history, the Supreme Court had never once interpreted the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause to protect gender equality. And it had not, it had just begun to protect what we now call the constitutional right of privacy. So it wasn't until the 1960s that even adult married couples had a constitutional right to use contraception. That was still a crime in many states. It wasn't until 1967 that people of different races could legally marry each other. That was a crime in many states. So, and I could go on, and I'm very proud to say that the strides forward that I'm mentioning were mostly in cases brought by the ACLU. Even in terms of freedom of speech, which is so fundamental and which the United States is so justly proud. It wasn't until the 1960s that the Supreme Court, for the very first time, struck down a federal statute as violating the First Amendment, even though Congress had been busily passing speech suppressive statutes since the 18th century. The famous, infamous Alien and Sedition Acts, shortly after the First Amendment was adopted, made it a crime to criticize government officials. That couldn't be more antithetical to the notion of free speech. I know, since you're an expert in music, that it wasn't until the mid 20th century that the Supreme Court recognized that artistic expression, including musical expression, comes within the protective scope of the First Amendment. So I find this record of progress very encouraging. It certainly doesn't blind me to the setbacks that we faced recently on abortion, and most dramatically, and the ongoing challenges in the areas of racial justice, gender justice, freedom of speech, the whole panoply of rights. But the progress we've made makes me very encouraged that we will be able to continue coming closer and closer to that ideal, that aspiration of all fundamental freedoms for all people, liberty and justice for all.
Awesome. Yeah, and I could argue that you played a key part in expanding civil liberties for everyone. And of course, we're talking about the ACLU here, where you work. One has to mention Ira Glasser, the iconic defender of civil liberties. And funny enough, I actually saw this video that was published online where he guides you through the process of what to do if you're arrested by the police, which is this is I'm talking from Hanoi, Vietnam here, and this is where our civil liberties, I guess, knowledge as well as our regime of protection is very low on that. If you happen to be caught by the police, it's either a bribe or you are, in jail. And I'm going to tell you about what I saw this morning. This is evening where I am. I was at downtown Hanoi, and there was a protest. And I'm not too well versed in Vietnamese politics, but the fact that there is a protest signifies that people have an awareness of that it is necessary, sometimes even a duty, to criticize the government. But at the same time, I saw that everyone who was attending the protest was masked and they were wearing sunglasses, and there were police cars following them at every step. And so I guess my question to you, well, the first one being, how would you convince someone who has not enjoyed the rights of free speech? There are many peoples in many countries who have not had that right, that it matters, that free speech is a human right that every human should enjoy.
I would think it's a challenging question because I have two opposite reactions. I have met many people who have lived in societies and under governments where their civil liberties are repressed, who are the most conscious of how important those rights are, because they understand how relatively impoverished their lives are, both as individuals and as members of a society. Sometimes I think they appreciate their rights much more than we in the United States, who can tend to take them for granted. Like the air we breathe, if you were deprived of it, you might suddenly appreciate it a lot more. But I think on the other hand, if you have never experienced it, you probably cannot appreciate the enormous positive potential that it has to enhance every single aspect of your life. So I think it's really interesting, Trung, that throughout history,
Mhm.
all over the world, we can document that people have clamored for free speech under every possible legal system. There seems to be some innate, universal human desire. And the reasons that people have laid down for being willing to fight for this right, even to the point of giving up their lives, risking their lives, and sacrificing their lives, it means so much to them. I mean, the famous example of Socrates drinking hemlock is an ancient example.
Mhm.
And we have, unfortunately, prisoners in your part of the world who
Mhm.
have gone to prison for daring to try to stand up for free speech and to exercise what should be a right of dissent and protest. But the reasons usually fall into, can be grouped into two major categories. One is the intrinsic value of free speech, what it means in and of itself to each of us as an individual to be able to engage in self expression, self exploration. It has been said that freedom of speech is the beginning of freedom of thought. We can't really formulate our thoughts unless we can engage in expression. And that includes, by the way, the freedom is not only the right to convey ideas and emotions and information, but also the right to receive it. So to communicate with other people, but also just to express ourselves. You know, we can just be an artist at home, writing a poem, singing a song, just shouting and cursing to let off anger, whatever it is, it becomes part of our self-definition. But it also has enormous instrumental value, that is to promote other really important individual and societal goods, starting with being able to communicate with other people. And in a democratic system of government, such as in the United States, you cannot have government by we, the people, to quote the opening words of our Constitution, where the people wield sovereign power, unless we have complete freedom to obtain information, exchange ideas, engage in vigorous debate, and certainly to criticize those who are elected to be accountable to us. How can we hold them accountable without free speech? So the Supreme Court has said that in our democratic form of government, speech about public matters is more than a matter of individual self-expression. It is the essence of self-government. Let me mention just one other value of free speech, and that is it is essential for the pursuit of truth. And
Mhm.
I mean the pursuit of truth in at least two senses. Number one, just to find out information and facts. What's true? You know, we're living in an age of rampant disinformation, fake news.
Mhm.
It's easier than ever to be fed false, misleading conspiracy theories. But with the tools of the internet, if you have free speech, it's also easier than ever to go to the original sources, to do your own research, to really investigate what are the actual facts, whether it's a matter of science or politics or culture, you know, any other matter of our society. But I'm also talking about truth in a more philosophical sense. What is the meaning of life? What is the best way that we individual human beings can use our rare, fleeting, precious time on Earth, you know, to engage with philosophers and poets and artists and other thinkers who might, and religious different religious beliefs, of course, and humanistic beliefs. So the pursuit of truth in that sense. And then one final example, civil society, which is especially important, again, in a democracy. One would hope it would exist in other types of government systems as well. to have organizations that promote human rights, that promote civil liberties, that promote the arts, community well-being. We think of civil society as kind of intermediary institutions between the government and individual people or families. It's really what makes for a very robust, pluralistic, dynamic culture and community. And none of that could exist without freedom of speech.
Yes. So I think every American would say that they support the right to free speech in principle, but when you test them, obviously they would they would erect limits and barriers towards which speech they find acceptable and which they do not. And I think one of the challenges that all free speech advocates, like you and I, is that, well, we have to distinguish between defending the rights of free speech to very indecent, very abhorrent people versus endorsing their beliefs that they express via speech. I think, of course, of the Brandenburg case. Uh, Mr. Brandenburg clearly deserved, is entitled to his free speech rights, which did not fit the, I guess, the category of, was it incitement? Yes, incitement. That was the word I'm looking for. And of course, in the documentary Mighty Ira, Mr. Glasser spends a lot of time talking about the Skokie versus Illinois case, which I finally understand what the Illinois Nazis in the movie Blues Brothers was referring to. So, yeah, please make the, how would a civil libertarian, an advocate for free speech, distinguish between the two, the right of free speech and the actual content of that speech, abhorrent as it is?
I think the best known explanation or statement of that really fundamental principle is usually attributed to the French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, but we now know it was actually said by his biographer, a woman named Evelyn Beatrice Hall. She was paraphrasing his views, and the paraphrase was, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." And the United States Supreme Court has adopted that principle as what it has called the bedrock principle underlying freedom of speech in the United States, which is that it is viewpoint neutral, it is content neutral. Government may neither may never censor you solely because of disapproval, dislike, even loathing of your viewpoint, no matter how unpopular it is, no matter how despised it is, by no matter how many powerful government officials, even by the vast majority of members of the society. That is never a justification for suppressing it. If you disagree with it, ignore it, refute it, answer back, argue against it, but do not suppress it. And that turns out to be not only consistent with the principle of I would have to say not only individual liberty, but also equality, because what this viewpoint neutrality principle reflects is an equality in the realm of ideas, that we all are equally entitled to freedom of speech, no matter who we are and no matter what we believe. We have to leave it to democratic processes to decide which ideas will triumph in the political sphere, right? You vote for the candidates who are saying things and whose ideas accord with yours. But the whole idea of the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment free speech guarantee, is that there are some rights that are so fundamental that no majority, no matter how large, may take them away from any minority, no matter how small or despised. And I think that's really a beauty of living in a pluralistic democracy. You know, we do encounter ideas that we loathe or disagree with, but I think it is a price well worth paying for individual liberty. And by the way, for the opportunity to respond to those ideas. I was beginning to say that not only is this principle consistent with individual liberty and equality, but it's also the most effective way to counter ideas that we find hateful. I actually wrote an entire book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. It embodies that idea that suppressing hate speech is not an effective way to suppress hateful ideas or to reduce hateful or discriminatory actions. We know that no matter how well-intended censorship is, it is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. It just makes it much harder to discover who has those ideas, to try to dissuade them from continuing to harbor those ideas. It makes it harder for law enforcement to monitor them, to make sure they don't act on those ideas in a violent or discriminatory manner. And what I found when I was doing the research for that book, Chuang, which goes back to 2017 when I was writing it, I found that human rights activists all over the world, in every part of the world, under every kind of government system, opposed censoring hate speech and other controversial speech, not because of free speech guarantees in their own constitutions. That kind of censorship is permitted in most other countries, but strictly from the perspective of what is the most effective way to counter hatred and stereotyping and discrimination. What is the most effective way to advance dignity, equality, diversity, inclusivity? And the conclusion was that censoring hate speech just empowers the government to go after dissidents and minority groups and to use it as a pretext to silence people or ideas it dislikes. And ironically, that means that under hate speech laws, the very groups that are hoped to be protected are the ones that are disproportionately silenced. So the most effective measures are counter speech, education, anti-discrimination laws, and laws against discriminatory violence.
Yes. So the way I see it, I think more in a Kantian framework of humans have rights because they are bound by duties to and responsibilities to either become better individuals or to foster a more cohesive society. And and I think about how if we have the right to free speech, as you do, what is each individual's responsibility with their free speech rights, aside from obviously if in your case you educate the people of the right to free speech, or like Ira himself. But I think we all should remember that there are certain kinds of expressions that we can do, doesn't mean that we should. And this is a very contentious example, but let's say flag burning. I'm sure that flag burning in the US is considered a proper form of speech or speech-like expression. That doesn't mean that everyone should do it. And I'm sure that 99% of Americans would find that to be an anti-American, and they would probably ignore whatever the content of the flag burner wanna, or whatever ideas he wants to advance. So I guess my
I
question.
respectfully disagree with that particular example. I'll come back to it, but I certainly agree with the larger point, which is just because you have a right to say something doesn't mean that it is right to do so. Government should not punish us if we, misuse our free speech to not convey ideas in the most effective manner or engage with people in the most respectful manner but let me back up and say, as a professional educator and advocate, I'm constantly engaging in what you could call self-censorship, but you could call it editing, deciding on rhetoric, deciding on effective communication or effective advocacy. I choose my words and my mode of expression in a way that is optimally designed to achieve my goal, whether it's informing my students, whether it's, stimulating my students' questions and thinking, whether it's persuading a congressional committee that I'm testifying before, and so forth. So I think that, for example, I've written a lot about hate speech, and it's one of the most contentious forms of speech in the United States. There are a lot of efforts to increase government power and university power on campus to impose so-called hate speech codes. While I would defend somebody's right to make a racially inflammatory statement, I would be very critical of, let's say, a professor doing that in a classroom. We have a case going on in the United States right now involving a law professor, which is what I am, a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, very prestigious law school, Ivy League. Her name is Amy Wax, and I completely defend her right to make any what we call extracurricular statements outside of the classroom, no matter how provocative they are. I question her judgment in terms of, is it effective advocacy to use terminology that's going to off-put so many people and make them not welcome to her idea. But what I find especially problematic are allegations. And I have to say allegations because we've heard the complaints from the dean. We don't know whether she might disagree with it, might dispute the facts. This is an investigation that just began about 2 weeks ago. But the allegations are that she made racially charged statements directly to individual students in her class. I would, even if she has a constitutional right to do that, I would say that is very poor pedagogy, that it's a misuse of academic freedom because it is not calculated to educate your students. I think we have a professional responsibility in the classroom to treat every student with the utmost respect for their dignity, individuality, and equality, both as a matter of principle and as a matter of effectively educating them. So I agree with your general premise, absolutely. As to the particular example of flag burning, it is true that polls in the past have shown that large majorities, but not 99%, but large majorities of the American public find that to be an offensive manner of expression. By the way, I want to make a point to your audience, which you obviously know, but many of them may not. In two famous decisions, the United States Supreme Court back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, so quite a long time ago, held that there is a First Amendment right to burn the American flag, specifically to convey what you might call an anti-patriotic message. It's critical of certain government policies. By the way, I don't think the label unpatriotic is accurate. I like to quote Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, who said, dissent is the highest form of patriotism, right? Because for we, the people who wield our sovereign power, we have a responsibility, if we are responsible citizens, to call our government officials, emphasis on our, they are accountable to us, to call them into account, to criticize them if they are acting in ways that we think of as inconsistent with fundamental American values. So let's take, to use that word again, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Congress rushed through a piece of legislation called the Patriot Act. Deliberately, right? Because who's going to vote against something called that? You can imagine the sound bites in the next election campaign. We in the ACLU, along with many civil liberties and constitutional rights experts all across the ideological spectrum, both Democrats and Republicans, said this is the most unpatriotic act because it is violating fundamental principles of American democracy by giving government too much power to intrude into and engage in surveillance over and to detain people and to discriminate on the basis of religion and immigration status and so forth. So if somebody had burned the American flag in protest of the Patriot Act, arguably that is a very patriotic act. And I think the latest public opinion polls show that quite a substantial majority of the American public does defend the right to desecrate the flag is another term that's been used because I know you're involved in the arts, so you probably know that artists have used the American flag in many kinds of artistic depictions, and including having a flag on the floor where people can walk over it, or somehow tearing it in ways that are considered significant and aesthetically appealing, and that usually results in controversy. But they have an absolute right to do that precisely because it is such a powerful symbol. It really would be choking off people's freedom of speech if they could not use that symbol and work with it and manipulate it to express their views about politics, culture, the arts, or anything else.
Yes, I understand that. But since we are talking about music here, let's bring an example of a non-musician who apparently has influenced the course of popular music since probably the 80s or the 90s, which you've mentioned in the Tablet Magazine article, and that is Tipper Gore, the wife of Al. So she apparently, being a non-American, I know her as the reason why some of my favorite rap albums has that black and white parental advisory explicit content label on it, and Eminem mentioned her name in one of his songs, in a very derogatory manner. So I mentioned that you were around during when Tipper Gore appeared on the media. So would you care to give us the full story of how Tipper Gore, what was her grievances against popular music, and how did that lead to having the black and white label?
So these labels that are very stigmatizing, right? They're parental advisory labels, and I think they're required to print the lyrics. And the whole idea was that it will not only deter parents from buying the albums or allowing their minor children to buy or listen to them, but the real concern was that this kind of music wouldn't be produced in the first place because the label was so stigmatizing that it wouldn't be commercially viable. And so, the fact that you buy an album that or are able to listen to an album that has a label is the least bad outcome. Who knows how much other music you never got to hear that was never recorded, never distributed, precisely in order to avoid that stigmatizing label. So, what sometimes people will say to me, oh, isn't a label more free speech? It's just giving you information about the expression. And the answer is no. When it becomes this kind of scarlet letter, it has an enormous and unmeasurable chilling effect, which is exactly what was the intent. Now, Tipper Gore and her parents' music advisory council back in the 80s were very concerned about rap music, which was beginning to become popular among white suburban kids. And the lyrics were explicit in terms of violence and sexuality. Some conservative parents in particular are very concerned about some lyrics that were anti-police, very prescient in terms of the anti-police abuse movement that has so galvanized since the tragic murder of George Floyd, but was already, for those of us in the civil liberties world, we were already aware of these kinds of tragedies and crusading against them. And the rap artists coming out of the kinds of communities where these incidents occurred, not surprisingly, included that in their art. So you had police unions that were mobilizing and other supporters of law enforcement who were mobilizing against this music. So, there were deeply political messages here, as well as messages about society and race and gender, all of the hot button issues. So it's not only artistic expression, important as that is, but it's also expression about matters of public concern. Yet we had so many government officials and influential citizens, including Tipper Gore, all across the political spectrum. She was a liberal. Liberals generally were going after the alleged misogyny, the alleged violence in the lyrics. The conservatives were going against the pornography and the alleged pornography and the alleged anti-police language. So there was a, coalition of strange bedfellows that led to hearings in Congress with very strong impetus to pass legislation that would inquire either government banning of certain lyrics or other kinds of government regulations. And as industries often do, the music industry voluntarily agreed to the labels, just the way the film industry voluntarily agreed to the film rating system in order to avoid more heavy-handed government regulation. And I put the word voluntarily in scare quotes because obviously it wasn't really a voluntary choice. It was under pressure from government action. And it's too bad in the sense that if the government had actually mandated these requirements, we could have brought a First Amendment lawsuit against it, I think with a good chance of winning. But the First Amendment only applies to government action, government mandates, government laws, government prosecution, and so forth. So the fact that an industry is allegedly voluntarily engaging in labeling means we have no First Amendment recourse, and they can claim that they're exercising their own First Amendment rights. I hope, and here's where you can enlighten me, Chuang, I hope that the labels haven't really deterred people from listening to the music. I don't know to what extent, if you're aware to what extent it has deterred certain music from being produced. That is many decades ago. I assume the norms have changed greatly since then. So maybe even if it had a chilling impact back then, it no longer does. If you have a minute, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Oh yeah, I do. I guess the answer to your question is no, not really. In fact, it rather encouraged us to to listen to this stuff.
There's the so-called forbidden fruits effect of censorship.
Yeah, it's the same way with really R-rated films. That it and a film which is advertised to have a lot of sexually charged or ultra-violent material in it will just encourage us 13, 14-year-olds more to see it.
My husband and I tease each other when we're looking at Netflix because they'll flash the warnings.
Oh
And
yeah.
last night we saw one. I said, "Oh, Ellie, I'm sorry to tell you, but the only bad thing in this is smoking."
Yeah. And speaking of these warnings, it seems that well, I would like to bring in another example of a kind of nascent anti-free speech movement that is actually coming from the left-wing side of the political aisle, which I assume you sort of belong to, left, liberal, progressive. Um, this is they
I'm
actually
more. I could usually call myself I call myself a libertarian because I'm much more of a civil libertarian than I
yes,
am a liberal. If I have to choose between liberal policies and civil liberties wins for me. But you're right. In general, I'm a political liberal.
awesome, yeah. So so the anti-free speech case within the liberal side is that well, if there is a absolute free speech right, it would endanger an individual's right to self-expression. And I think, for example, of say this phenomenon that is coming up called dead naming, where if you call someone who is a trans person by their former first name, then that would be that would be considered a human rights violation. And so there's that. And yeah, and there are obviously trigger warnings, how that's why comedians often find it very hard to perform in college campuses. I hear that even Jerry Seinfeld, one of probably the least offensive funny comedians, find it hard to perform in college campuses because there are such a wide array of words or phrases that you cannot say, even if you don't mean it in an offensive manner. And probably even after the George Floyd incident, we we always have to say the N word to refer to that word which shall not be spoken, even if it is not in a discriminatory context.
Derogatory context, right?
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. And so, how would you respond to this? To this sort of like curtailment of free speech, but in the name of proper self-expression. Say, yeah,
It's a fair point, but censorship is not the answer. So the point is this, that anybody's exercise of free speech can possibly have a chilling effect on somebody else's exercise of free speech. I'm a professor. If I say in my class, here's my question, and I only want to hear from students who know the answer, I'm arguably suppressing the speech of
right.
hopefully not many students who don't have the answer. Or to take a more subtle example, I'm a teacher who is who will respond in a Socratic dialogue to whatever point the student makes. That's common in law school. So there might be students who have an idea, but they're afraid to express it because they're afraid either I or another student is going to disagree with them. And so that's a chilling effect on their free speech. And the example you give is, let me give an even more extreme example than you give. If somebody shouts a racist epithet or an anti-Semitic epithet in my face, that could well stun me into silence. I remember the very first time, I recount this in my book, the very first time that did happen to me, relatively late in my life, astoundingly, I was just so shocked that I literally was stunned into silence. And, there are many, many other examples we could give. So the importance for us as members of a free society, in my case, or as members of the academic profession, is to do whatever we can to provide the resources to every student, to every member of our society, so that they have the education, they have the articulateness, they have the self-confidence, they have the resilience to dare to express themselves, even in adverse circumstances ranging from your teacher might think that you gave the wrong answer, your classmates might disagree with you, to somebody calls you something intending to insult you, and you don't give them the power to disparage you. You look down on them. And I'm going to quote my friend and colleague, Jonathan Rauch, a wonderful author and journalist whose latest book is The Constitution of Knowledge. John is a lifelong crusader for marriage equality, along with other LGBTQ rights. He was a crusader for marriage equality long before it became mainstream. Even among the gay community, he was discouraged. He was said, that's too much of a fringe issue. It will alienate us. So, he couldn't be more stalwart in his support for these rights. So I'll give a slight trigger warning for what he says in his book. He says, if somebody calls me a fucking faggot, I process that as she needs counseling, not that I'm a fucking faggot. So that's the kind of attitude that we have to inculcate so that people will not feel silenced even by the most insulting use of free speech by other people, but rather will feel emboldened and empowered to exercise their own rights of counter speech.
Oh yeah. That is something that I'm sort of concerned about as well. For example, you've mentioned the recent Supreme Court relating to abortion matters, and that I understand that in the US, that is a very, very contentious issue, and I imagine that there are still very heated debate about it. I think one of the, I guess, errors of the pro-life movement, which I would admit I'm a supporter of. I have my religious convictions, which thinks that it is an immoral act. But nevertheless,
I have to say, I don't share those convictions, but I have great respect for them. I have debated and discussed with people of faith who have those views, and I have to say I especially respect them when the views are shown consistently, so that it is respect not only for the potential life from the moment of conception, but also for actual children and mothers and families, through humanitarian and charitable support for them, and also in opposition to the death penalty. And to me, people who adhere to, reverence for life consistently through all of those different contexts, I really respect.
Yes, that's another problem that I have with the pro-life movement, which I hope that they would say, in that they need to be more consistent, in that they need to oppose the death penalty as well as euthanasia, as well as I guess, responsible gun laws, because again, another very contentious debate you have in the US is gun control or gun freedom in regards to the recent very, very tragic shootings. So back to the abortion debate, I think that the conservatives, the pro-lifers' mistake is that they focus a bit too much on the legal side. For 50 or so years since Roe v. Wade, they've mobilized, justices in order to strike that down. Again, I may find it to be a pleasant news, but what they didn't focus on is to foster a culture where people view life as beginning in the moment of conception, even though abortion may be legal to a certain extent, but to foster a culture that respects life as it is in the womb, without any sort of legal coercion, would probably be better for the pro-life cause.
May I interject something, Chuang? Quite a few years ago, the ACLU, which has advocated a woman's right to choose abortion, but has always defended free speech and free exercise of religion for pro-life demonstrators, which has separated us from others in the pro-choice movement. Planned Parenthood has boycotted ACLU events because we defend the right of pro-life demonstrators outside Planned Parenthood clinics, even though we also defend the right of people to access those clinics. But many decades ago, the ACLU was trying to work with pro-life organizations on issues of common concern. I tried to revive those collaborations without very much success, disappointingly, because it seems to me that no matter what your views are about when life begins, which is a religious perspective, or when personhood begins, which is a legal perspective, that one has to have reverence for at least the potential life, right? That's the concept that was embodied in Roe versus Wade, which I thought was very powerful. And nobody wants unintended, unplanned pregnancies. So why couldn't we have common collaboration in maximizing sex education, in maximizing access to contraception, in maximizing access to resources for pregnant women and for new mothers? Because unfortunately, evidence indicates that a lot of women who choose abortions do so for financial reasons, that they're afraid that they couldn't support, or they realize they couldn't support another child. So it seemed to me that no matter what your views are on, the pro-life perspective, that we should all agree on those policy initiatives.
Oh yes, that of course I do believe that the American political class can come together on at least these few issues. But to circle back to freedom of speech, I think that the laws that I guess the federal laws as well as the constitution of your country basically guarantees the right to free speech. Nevertheless, there are certain areas in our culture or the American culture where freedom of speech is seen as a bad thing. And I guess my question to you is how would you help foster a culture where free speech is respected? There's obviously there's the legal protection of it, but what about the culture? I mean, cultures can change, and
Thank you. And I see that you're drawing the parallel with the pro-life culture and the pro-free speech culture, that the law, to have the law protective of the right, is necessary, but not sufficient to meaningfully value and exercise the right. And so we can compare notes on our respective cultural reform projects or ideals, aspirations. And I think it has to begin with education and with information, right? I do think that, and surveys show that the more, and now I'm focusing on free speech, the more people know about free speech, the more supportive they are of it. And again, I think, it's so woven into elements of our life in the United States. We're so privileged in that sense that we just take it for granted. And especially taken for granted are all of the positive or uncontroversial uses of free speech. Those don't make the headlines, but it's when, the Unite the Right want to demonstrate in Charlottesville, or Donald Trump gives an incendiary speech on January 6th, or somebody puts out a conspiracy theory on social media. All the controversial speech becomes equated with free speech. You mentioned that old case that the ACLU successfully handled in Skokie. I mean, we're talking, that's a town in Illinois that had many Jewish residents, including at that time many Holocaust survivors back in the late 1970s. And we're talking about, they sought a permit for something like, I think they estimated that there would be 50 people demonstrating, was probably wildly exaggerated, and they wanted to demonstrate for 30 minutes. I mean, and then the worldwide attention that they received by the efforts to shut them down, first of all, show your, are consistent with your experience with the music labels, that you just draw disproportionate attention. But it was so completely unrepresentative of what free speech is actually used for, including back in the 1970s, it was mostly used by civil rights demonstrators to advocate for civil rights and against the perspective that the Nazis were demonstrating for. And, to this day, in the social media context, people are always looking at disinformation or extremist speech, and they just take for granted here I'm going to talk to the liberals who tend to make these critiques. They take for granted that the Black Lives Matter movement had existed before, but it really didn't gain traction until after social media made it so cheap and easy to organize and to gain supporters and to spread the message. Likewise with the Me Too movement. Obviously, there have been crusades against sexual harassment and sexual assault for decades, certainly since the advent of the third wave of feminism. But social media made it possible to actually put some teeth and force into that movement. Many political campaigns of young, relatively unknown, minority female candidates, going back to Barack Obama, people say he was the very first candidate who made effective use of social media and probably became politically successful much earlier than he otherwise would have. So I would urge people to really be cognizant of all of the benefits, whatever their views are, whatever their favorite causes are. These causes depend on a robust free speech. I would also make them cognizant of history in our country and sadly of the ongoing experience in other countries, including yours, where people don't have free speech and what they give up in consequence. Here we have mass protests all across the political spectrum for gun rights, against gun rights, for abortion, against abortion, for masks. You go on and on and on. We take it for granted. We have the right to protest. We just disagree about, what we should be protesting for and against. And we get irate, justifiably, if the police unwarrantedly detain somebody without probable cause that person is actually engaging in violence. The idea that the police might be able to arrest you just because they disagree with the message you're conveying, that would be completely anathema to, I'd say, 100% of Americans. And yet, we don't realize that without our robust free speech guarantee, that would be the situation. And that was the situation in my country, despite having a robust free speech guarantee on paper. But until you had organizations like the ACLU to really enforce it and to, represent people who could bring cases to court that led to court decisions. The First Amendment was just nice words written on a piece of paper. So we have to reinstill that real understanding, appreciation, and commitment to free speech to complement the law.
Yes, you've articulated as much in the article, and that is, freedom of speech. It protects the constitutional rights of, Brandenburg and the Skokie marchers, but it also protected the constitutional rights of Martin Luther King Jr. and the gay rights activists and protesters, and even the Vietnam War protesters. And so, I think once, especially liberal students, once they realize that it works both ways, and you need to know both sides of the of what free speech entails, then they may be a bit more cognizant of their own rights as well as the rights of others. So a final question, since we're talking about university students and I'm a recent graduate. So you participated in the advisory board of the University of Austin, Texas, which is, a new initiative to form a university. Um, so how did that come about?
The University of Austin was launched amazingly just a little bit more than a year ago. I say amazingly because it has accomplished so much in such a short time.
Mhm.
But it was the brainchild of a number of academics, including university and college presidents and professors, as well as public intellectuals from various fields, science, social science, humanities, who are dispirited about the deterioration of academic freedom and freedom of speech on too many campuses in the United States, where a pall of orthodoxy has descended. There's a monoculture. These campuses are overwhelmingly liberal or progressive in the politics of students, faculty members, and administrators. And polls show alarming rates of self-censorship on the part of all members of the campus community. Not the constructive kind of self-censorship that you and I were talking about, Chuang, where we exercise responsibility in order to be sure that we are communicating effectively and responsibly in the classroom, for example, but a very negative kind of self-censorship where entire important subjects are not addressed at all, or certain perspectives are not aired at all, only because of fear that somebody may be offended or view your perspective as racist or homophobic. So the topics that are mostly avoided, number one is race, which is clearly of critical importance. No pun intended. We have a big debate about so-called critical race theory. Discussion about gender and sexual issues is also very much reduced. And these are precisely, they are sensitive topics because they are important topics. And it's really a tragedy if they can't be explored honestly and openly in a university setting. Where is that going to happen in our society? So there have been a number of new organizations have spawned within the recent past to try to deal with this problem on campuses. But the idea of the founders of the University of Austin was, well, maybe we should just start from scratch. It may be too slow to turn the ship around, to use that metaphor, if it's ever going to happen with these universities that are much older. So maybe we should have a new model. And speaking as somebody who's been on the advisory board since the beginning, and speaking, I think, for the vast majority of us who are engaged in this, committed to this enterprise, we haven't given up hope on the existing universities, but we do want to provide a new model, which, among other things, will hopefully galvanize efforts and initiatives at the existing universities to renew and reaffirm and put new life into their paper commitments to academic freedom and intellectual heterodoxy.
Yes, as someone who cares about the academic life, who values the academic life, and wish that we foster a better university culture, I wish your efforts as well as that of the University of Austin all the success it deserves. So Nadine Strossen, I'm glad that we finally have this conversation. Thank you very much for sharing your extremely valuable insights on free speech and civil liberties.
I'm so grateful to you, Trong, for your wonderful podcast and for your really courageous and commendable and inspiring commitment to free speech and your exercise of free speech and making it available to all of your audience and fans.
Oh, much appreciated. Thank you. And of course, you mentioned before that you were hit with the COVID virus. So I wish you good health and I hope you take care of yourself.
Thank you so much. When we're off air, can I talk to you briefly?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So when we're stopping recording for your audience purposes?
Of course, we're stopping right now. So